an object covered in pure gold, kept in the holiest place in Israel. No one could touch it, or they would die. This was the most feared object in the Bible, and today we are going to reveal its secrets and understand, in the light of Scripture, how it really worked. In the Sinai Desert, after their liberation from Egypt, the people of Israel were not merely a multitude walking toward the Promised Land. They were a nation in formation. They had witnessed powerful signs, crossed the sea, received daily provision, and now faced a new challenge, learning to live as a covenant people. It was not enough to have been freed. They needed to understand how to relate to the God who had redeemed them. It is in this context that one of the most detailed instructions in the book of Exodus emerges. Starting in chapter 25, God commands Moses to build the tabernacle, a portable structure that would accompany Israel during their journey through the desert. Every measurement, every material, and every utensil had a specific purpose. Nothing was improvised. Everything followed a pattern revealed on the mountain. At the center of this sacred structure was an inner chamber called the Holy of Holies, a space separated by a thick veil where only the high priest could enter, and even then, only once a year, as described in Leviticus 16. There, the most important object of the entire Israelite worship system was kept. The Ark of the Covenant was not presented as an amulet, nor as an instrument of human power. It symbolized something much greater, the presence of God in the midst of the people. It was the meeting point between divine holiness and human reality. Therefore, approaching it required reverence, obedience, and priestly mediation. Understanding this historical context is essential, because before understanding how it worked, we need to see the spiritual and national environment in which it was established. And then the inevitable question arises, how exactly was this ark built? If you want to continue discovering the mysteries and behind-the-scenes stories of the Bible with depth and faithfulness to the Scriptures, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write in the comments which city you are watching from. It will be a joy to know how far the Word of God is reaching. When God commands the construction of the Ark of the Covenant in Exodus 25:10-22, the biblical text does not merely present a general idea, it provides exact measurements, specific materials, and meticulous instructions. This already reveals something important. The Ark could not be the product of human creativity. It had to reflect exactly the pattern shown to Moses on the mountain. The first element mentioned is acacia wood. This wood was abundant in the desert region and known for its strength and durability. It was not a fragile material. Acacia withstands extreme temperature variations and is naturally resistant to insects and decay. In other words, from its structural base, the ark was designed to accompany the people during years of travel. The structure had to be firm, stable, and prepared for constant transport. The measurements are also described precisely: 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. Considering the traditional Hebrew cubit, this corresponds approximately to 1.10 meters in length by 70 centimeters in width and 70 centimeters in height. It was not a gigantic object, but it was not small either. It had balanced proportions, sufficient to hold the sacred contents while also allowing for mobility. After the wooden structure came the covering. The ark was to be covered with pure gold, inside and out. This detail is significant. The gold wasn't just on the visible parts. Even the interior was covered. This indicates that the holiness represented there was not superficial. It wasn't an outward appearance. Every part, including those not easily seen, was meant to reflect purity and honor. Around the top, there was a gold frame, a kind of trim that defined its edge. This detail reinforced its distinction from all the other utensils in the tabernacle. Nothing about it was ordinary. Everything pointed to separation and consecration. Another key point was the 4 cast gold rings, fixed at the 4 corners of the ark, 2 on each side. Poles, also made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold, passed through these rings. The function of these poles was clear: transport. The ark was not to be carried directly by hand. It was lifted by the Levites using the poles, which were never to be removed from the rings, as the text itself emphasizes. This practical detail reveals an essential principle. Direct contact with the object was not permitted. Transportation followed a specific pattern. are preserving the sanctity represented there. Later, when this pattern was ignored, the consequences became evident in the history of Israel. But from the beginning, the system was clearly established. At the top of the ark was the most significant piece of the entire structure, the mercy seat, called kaporet in Hebrew. Unlike the rest of the ark, which was made of covered wood, the mercy seat was to be made from a single piece of solid gold. It was not merely a functional lid. It was the central element of the object's spiritual significance. Above the mercy seat were two cherubim of hammered gold, molded from the same piece. They were not separate figures added later. They were part of the gold block itself. Their wings extended upward and bent toward each other, covering the mercy seat. Their faces were turned toward the center, toward the place where the blood would be sprinkled on the Day of Atonement. It is at this point that the text makes a crucial statement. In Exodus 25:22, God tells Moses that there, above the mercy seat, between the cherubim, he would meet with the people and speak with Moses. In other words, the ark was not just a container. It was the designated point for divine communication. From a functional point of view, the ark fulfilled three roles simultaneously. Structurally, it was a sacred chest that would hold the elements of the covenant. Liturgically, it was the center of the annual ritual of atonement. And symbolically, it represented the invisible throne of God in the midst of Israel. The choice of cherubim is also not random. In the biblical narrative, cherubim appear associated with the presence and glory of God. In Genesis, the cherubim guard the way to the tree of life. In Ezekiel, they are linked to the vision of the divine throne. Placing them above the mercy seat reinforces the idea that that space represented authority and holiness. It is important to note that there is no description of internal mechanisms, gears, or any hidden mystical element. The Bible presents the ark as a physical, concrete object, skillfully crafted, but whose meaning transcended matter. Its functioning did not depend on human energy or invented secret rituals. It depended on the order established by God and the obedience of the people. The artisans responsible for the construction, led by Bezalel and Oholiab, as described in Exodus 31, were skilled, intelligent, and knowledgeable enough to execute the work. This shows that the process involved refined technique. Working pure gold, molding cherubim from a single piece, and precisely coating wood required experience and care. Nothing there was improvised. When the construction was completed, as described in Exodus 37, every detail faithfully followed the original instructions. The repetition of the specifications in the account of the execution reinforces that the standard was respected. The ark that came to accompany Israel was not the result of human interpretation, but of faithfulness to the instructions received. Thus, from its conception, the Ark of the Covenant was designed to unite mobility and holiness, structure and meaning, materiality and symbolism. Each part had a clear function. Each element pointed to something greater than itself. There were no pointless decorative excesses, nor superfluous details. Upon close observation of its construction, we realize that the awe associated with the Ark does not stem from obscure mystery, but from the precision with which it represented the holiness of God. It was made to be the center of the relationship between the Lord and Israel. And this naturally raises the next question. If the structure was so carefully planned, what exactly was placed inside it? After understanding how the ark was built, with each measurement defined and each detail carefully executed, an inevitable question arises. What exactly was placed inside it? If this object occupied the center of the Holy of Holies and represented the presence of God in the midst of Israel, its contents needed to have an equally profound meaning. The first answer appears in the book of Exodus itself. In Exodus 25:16, God commands Moses, "You shall put into the ark the testimony that I will give you." This testimony refers to the tablets of the law, the commandments written by God himself and given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Later, in Exodus 40:20, the text confirms that Moses placed the tablets inside the ark. They were the heart of the covenant. The tablets of the law represented the formal covenant between God and Israel. And they were not merely moral rules. They were the terms of the relationship between the Lord and the people he had delivered from Egypt. Placing these tablets inside the ark meant that the foundation of the nation was kept in the most sacred place. The law was not peripheral, it was central. Israel existed as a people because there was an established covenant. But the New Testament adds more details. In Hebrews 9:4, we read that inside the ark were also a golden jar containing manna and Aaron's rod that budded. These two elements broaden our understanding of the object's significance. Manna directly relates to the desert period, when the people depended daily on divine provision. As recorded in Exodus 16, God commanded that an omer of manna be kept for your generations, as a testimony of the Lord's faithfulness. This food, which appeared every morning, sustained Israel for 40 years. Keeping a portion inside the ark was to preserve the concrete memory that God not only establishes laws, but also provides sustenance. Aaron's rod is linked to a specific episode described in Numbers 16 and 17. After a rebellion led by Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, who questioned the priestly leadership, God determined that each tribe should present a rod with the name of its leader. The rod that blossomed would indicate who had been chosen. The next day, Aaron's rod, from the tribe of Levi, not only blossomed, but produced almonds. It was a clear sign of the priestly authority established by God. Keeping this rod inside the ark served as a permanent memorial against future rebellions. It represented that spiritual leadership was not the result of human ambition, but of divine choice. Thus, inside the ark were three complementary testimonies: the law, which revealed God's will, the manna, which demonstrated his provision, and the rod, which confirmed his authority. It is important to note that each item corresponds to a critical moment in the history of Israel. The tablets refer to Sinai, the moment of the covenant. The manna points to the daily dependence in the desert. The staff recalls the challenge to leadership and the reaffirmation of the priestly order. The ark, therefore, did not contain random objects. It preserved fundamental milestones in the spiritual formation of the nation. From a functional standpoint, the ark acted as a repository of the covenant's memory. Whenever the high priest entered the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, as per Leviticus 16, he approached a place that contained the very terms of the covenant. And it is significant that the blood of the sacrifice was sprinkled on the mercy seat, which covered precisely these elements. The image is clear. Atonement was linked to the law that had been violated, to the provision that had often been disregarded, and to the authority that had been challenged. The presence of these objects also dismantles any idea that the ark was a war talisman or an empty symbol. It was, in fact, a constant reminder of Israel's spiritual responsibility. Every time it was transported, every time it was placed in the center of the camp, it carried with it the story of the relationship between God and the people. Another relevant detail is that the biblical text never suggests that the power resided in the objects themselves. The manna stored inside the ark did not continue to fall from heaven. The rod did not keep sprouting repeatedly. The tablets did not glow with their own energy. The meaning lay in what they represented, not in mystical properties. The holiness associated with the ark came from the declared presence of God upon it, not from the materials or items stored inside. By understanding its internal contents, we realize that the ark was a synthesis of Israel's spiritual experience, revelation, provision, and authority. It constantly reminded them that their relationship with God involved obedience, daily trust, and respect for the established order. And yet, even as a symbol of covenant and divine care, the ark was also associated with fear. People died handling it improperly. Foreign peoples suffered consequences for capturing it. And this leads us to an inevitable question. If the ark represented God's presence among the people, why did it also become the most feared object in the Bible? If the ark held the symbols of the covenant and represented the presence of God, why did it inspire so much fear? The answer lies not in superstition, but in holiness. The Bible makes it clear that proximity to what was consecrated demanded absolute obedience to divine instructions. The first element that reveals this is in Leviticus 16. Only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. He didn't enter just any way. He needed to offer sacrifices for himself and the people, wear specific garments, and follow a strict order. The text shows that the approach was carefully regulated because that space represented an encounter with God's holiness. It wasn't an ordinary place. It was the most sacred point in the entire nation. The fear, therefore, did not come from the object itself, but from what it represented. Approaching the ark unprepared meant ignoring the separation between the sacred and the common, and when this separation was disregarded, the consequences were serious. One of the best-known episodes occurs in 1 Samuel 6. After capturing the ark in battle, the Philistines imagined they had defeated the God of Israel. They took it to their territories and placed it in the temple of Dagon. However, the narrative shows that the situation quickly turned into a calamity for them. Statues fell, diseases struck the population, and panic spread through the cities the ark passed through. The text does not describe magic, but it demonstrates that treating the presence of God as a war trophy brought judgment upon those who handled it improperly. Another striking moment is found in 2 Samuel 6. During David's reign, the ark was being transported on a new cart, a method that did not correspond to the instructions given previously. When the oxen stumbled, Uzzah reached out to steady it and died instantly. The narrative is brief and direct. The gesture may seem well-intentioned, but it contradicted the pattern established since the desert. The ark should be carried by the Levites, using poles, without direct contact. This episode caused fear even in David. The king realized that it was not a matter of good intentions, but of obedience to the instructions given by God. Holiness could not be treated informally. These accounts show a consistent pattern. Whenever the ark was handled outside of defined parameters, the result was judgment. Not because the object had power of its own, but because it symbolized something infinitely greater. It pointed to the reality that God is holy and that his presence cannot be reduced to custom or tradition. At the same time, fear did not negate hope. The very existence of the mercy seat indicated that there was a path to atonement and reconciliation. The same place that represented holiness also offered forgiveness when the ritual was performed according to divine instruction. Thus, the ark became feared because it constantly reminded people that the relationship with God involves reverence. It taught that faith and obedience go hand in hand, and that the divine presence should not be trivialized. If this content is making sense to you and is broadening your understanding of the Bible, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment on what has caught your attention so far. In the next few minutes, we'll see how this same ark was also at the center of some of the greatest victories in Israel's history. While the ark was associated with holiness and awe, it was also present during decisive moments in the history of Israel, not as a war amulet, but as a visible sign that God guided the people in their battles and conquests. One of the first major episodes occurs in Joshua 3, during the crossing of the Jordan River. After Moses' death, Joshua assumes leadership and leads the people toward the Promised Land. The Jordan River was at its flood stage, overflowing its banks. Humanly speaking, crossing millions of people in that scenario seemed impossible. It is then that God gives a specific instruction. The priests should carry the ark and enter the waters first. The text recounts that when the priests' feet touched the river, the waters coming from upstream accumulated, forming a barrier, while the rest flowed downstream. The people crossed on dry land. The ark remained in the middle of the riverbed until everyone had passed. Only then did the priests leave, and the waters returned to their normal course. Observe the logic of the narrative. The ark went ahead. It wasn't the army that led, nor the military strategy. It was the symbol of God's presence that opened the way. The message was clear. The conquest of the land would not be the result of human strength alone, but of divine guidance. Immediately following, in Joshua 6, we find another remarkable episode, the fall of Jericho. The city was fortified, with high walls and an impressive defensive structure for the time. God, however, established an unusual method. For 6 days, the people were to circle the city once a day. 7 priests would blow trumpets before the ark, and it would remain in the center of the march. On the 7th day, the process would be repeated 7 times. After the prolonged sound of the trumpets and the shouts of the people, the walls would fall. And so it happened. The ark was not a siege weapon. It did not physically knock down stones, but its presence at the center of the strategy reinforced that victory came from God's intervention. This pattern repeats itself at other times. In Numbers 10, when the people set out on their journey, Moses declared words that associated the movement of the ark with the Lord's actions against their enemies. In 1 Samuel 4, when Israel takes it to the battlefield against the Philistines, The adversaries themselves show fear upon hearing that it had arrived at the Hebrew camp, remembering the mighty deeds of the God of Israel in the past. However, this same episode also teaches an important limitation. Israel took the ark to war as if its mere presence guaranteed automatic victory, but the people were spiritually distant. The result was defeat and the capture of the sacred object. This shows that the ark did not function as a mechanical guarantee of success. It did not replace repentance or faithfulness. It represented the presence of God, but it did not manipulate the divine will. Throughout historical narratives, it becomes evident that the ark occupied a central position in decisive moments. It led journeys, accompanied battles, and marked important transitions. Its presence indicated that God was guiding the people's steps. But there is something curious. After the establishment of the temple in Jerusalem under Solomon, the ark is placed in the Holy of Holies of the new sanctuary. The text of 1 Kings 8 describes the solemn ceremony in which the priests bring it into the temple, and the glory of the Lord fills the place. It is a culminating point in the history of Israel. And then, gradually, she disappears from the biblical narrative. This leads us to an inevitable question that spans centuries. If the ark was so central to the history of Israel, where is it today? What happened to the most feared and revered object in the scriptures? After occupying a central position in the tabernacle, crossing the Jordan River, encircling Jericho, and being installed in Solomon's temple under a solemn ceremony, the Ark of the Covenant simply ceases to appear clearly in the biblical narrative. And it is precisely this silence that has sparked so many questions throughout the centuries. The last direct historical mention occurs in the context of King Josiah's reign, in 2 Chronicles 35:3. At this time, Josiah promotes a major spiritual reform in Judah and orders the Levites to place the ark in the temple built by Solomon. The instruction indicates that, at some earlier point, it had been removed or moved, possibly during periods of idolatry or spiritual neglect. However, the text does not detail the circumstances. Shortly afterward, Jerusalem would face the Babylonian invasion. The temple would be looted and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, as reported in 2 Kings 25. Several sacred utensils are listed as having been taken to Babylon. Curiously, the ark does not appear among the items mentioned. This detail is significant. If it had been captured like the other gold objects, it would be natural for the text to record it. The absence of any direct reference to its fate has opened the door to numerous theories throughout history. Some suggest it was hidden before the Babylonian invasion. Others speculate that it was destroyed or secretly taken to another location. There are extra-biblical traditions that claim different fates, but it is important to maintain a clear distinction. The Bible does not reveal where the ark ended up. This silence is not accidental. From the post-exilic period onward, when the Second Temple was built, there is no biblical record of the ark being placed back in the Holy of Holies. Yet the system of worship continued. This indicates that, although the ark was central to a particular period in history, the relationship between God and his people was not limited to the physical existence of that object. There is also a prophetic passage in Jeremiah 3:16 that is noteworthy. The prophet declares that a time would come when people would no longer say, "Ark of the Covenant of the Lord," nor would it be remembered or made again. The emphasis would be on God's presence in a broader sense among the people. This statement suggests a transition in the understanding of divine presence. Throughout the centuries, the search for the ark has become the subject of expeditions, legends, and popular narratives. However, from a biblical perspective, the focus was never on its geographical location, but on what it represented. It symbolized God's holiness, the covenant established at Sinai, the provision in the desert, and the confirmed priestly authority. When we look at the entire timeline, we realize that the ark played a specific role within a stage of the history of redemption. It marked the period of the desert, the conquest, and the unified monarchy. After that, the biblical narrative directs attention to other aspects of the relationship between God and his people. Thus, the question, "Where is the ark today?" remains without a definitive answer in the scriptures. And perhaps this absence of an answer is intentional. The center of biblical faith has never been an object, however sacred, but God himself and his promises. The most feared object in the Bible has disappeared from recorded history, but the message it carried about holiness, covenant, and divine presence continues to resonate through generations. And it is precisely this message that leads us to the final reflection on the true meaning of the Ark of the Covenant. If this study deepened your understanding of the Ark of the Covenant and helped you see the Bible more clearly, take this opportunity to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss future studies. And write in the comments, what part of this story caught your attention the most? I really want to read your opinion and know where you are watching from. Throughout the biblical narrative, the Ark of the Covenant was not merely a carefully constructed sacred object. It was the visible center of a profound spiritual truth. God desired to dwell in the midst of his people, but his presence is holy and cannot be treated in an ordinary way. From the Sinai desert, through miraculous crossings, decisive battles, and its installation in the Temple of Jerusalem, the Ark marked key moments in the history of Israel. It held the symbols of the covenant, served as a reminder of daily provision in the desert, and bore witness to the authority established by God. Every detail of its construction and every episode involving its presence pointed to a constant principle. A relationship with God demands reverence, obedience, and trust. The awe surrounding the Ark was not superstition. It was an awareness of its sanctity. When the instructions were followed, it symbolized guidance, protection, and victory. When it was treated carelessly or used as an instrument of human interest, it became a sign of judgment. The same object that accompanied the parting of the Jordan River was also present in moments of discipline. This reveals that the power was never in the wood, the gold, or the cherubim, but in the presence of the Lord, who manifested himself there. And then, when the Ark disappears from recorded history, something important happens. The biblical narrative begins to shift its focus from the object to the promise. The prophets begin to speak of a new stage in the relationship between God and his people. Holiness remains central, but the emphasis is no longer on a specific physical symbol. The mercy seat, where blood was sprinkled once a year, constantly reminded us of the need for atonement. The law within the Ark showed the divine pattern. The manna reminded us of daily dependence. Aaron's rod pointed to the authority established by God. All of this formed a portrait of the human condition before the Creator, the need for direction, sustenance, leadership, and forgiveness. When we look at the complete story, we realize that the Ark functioned as a meeting point between justice and mercy. The blood of atonement was placed upon the tablets that revealed the law. Holiness was not annulled, but guilt could be covered according to the established model. Today we have no biblical record of where the Ark is. No passage confirms its location. And perhaps this teaches us something essential. That biblical faith never depended on the possession of a sacred object, but on trust in God's promises. What remained was not the wooden structure covered in gold, but the message it carried. The story of the Ark invites us to reflect on how we treat what is sacred. It reminds us that the presence of God is not something trivial. At the same time, it shows that the Lord desires to reveal himself, guide, and remain close to his people. Understanding the secrets of the Ark of the Covenant means understanding that the Bible does not present empty symbols, but signs that communicate profound truths about who God is and how he relates to humanity. When we read Exodus, Joshua, Samuel, or Chronicles with this perspective, the narrative takes on a new dimension. May this understanding strengthen your faith. I deepen your respect for the scriptures and renew your confidence in God's promises. Because knowing biblical history is not just acquiring information, it is drawing closer to the revelation that transcends generations and continues to speak to the heart of those who desire to understand.